As you'll see from the agenda, the topic is very specific and in fact flows on, coincidentally I think, from some of the earlier conversations, i.e. where do we go from here? We all know, living in this country, that it's small, 5 million people on the geographic edge of Europe. But I think what's really exciting, if we look at what's happening now in the country, and of course, underpinned by the government strategy, is a real opportunity to exploit not just what's going to happen in terms of infrastructure and services in the next few years, but also what we've already got. And that's not just in the rural areas of the country, critical and challenging though that is, but also in our cities. And if we look at our population base across Scotland's 7 cities that we have, roughly 86% of the population either live in them or live within about an hour's commuting times to those, and the cities are relatively well connected already. So I think that the big thing, and it has been touched on already, is all about exploitation in parallel with driving out the infrastructure and the technology to support the country's aspirations. So this morning, I'm just going to briefly introduce the 4 panellists and colleagues I've kindly volunteered to take part in this morning. You'll know many of them. First of all, Ross Martin on the far left. Many of you will know Ross. He's been passionate about driving the reform agenda, largely in the public sector for about 20 years, and has himself led significant change programmes in policing, education and local government throughout the 90s. And of course, a lot of that has been underpinned by the evolution in digital technology. Ross is now Director of the Centre for Scottish Public Policy and is at the heart in Scotland of developing thinking around how we embrace change in the next few years. Secondly, to his right is Paul White. Paul's Director of Networks at Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, and of course is in the management team of the national body representing the third sectors, charities, community groups, social enterprises, which are clearly growing, and part of that will be in the kind of world we're talking about throughout the country. He's responsible for developing networking and, critically, collaboration, partnership we've heard about earlier, between third sector organisations and anyone else that we can want to work with and support them. Critically, just now, he's responsible for managing the rollout of Milo, and I'm sure that's a name from Catch-22, is it? Not sure, for those who've read it. But Milo, in this context, under Paul, is a database designed to make it easy for people to access, engage in and support voluntary action in Scotland, which is really, really critical for us as a society. Next to Paul is Andrew Unsworth. Critically just now, and I think it's been fantastic how in the last few years, a couple of years particularly, much more focused on the cities as hubs of the economy. And Andrew's leading the digital work stream in the Scottish Cities Alliance, tasked with supporting Scotland's 7 cities, working collaboratively in how we develop the strategies and then, of course, do something about that. And last, but by no means least, Carroll Buxton, who is Director of Regional Development for Highlands and Islands Enterprise. So apart from leading the work to develop the digital connectivity, clearly, which is critical for the Highlands and Islands, Carroll's also responsible for property development and supporting the UHI, which, of course, from a skills point of view, University of the Highlands Islands, is going to play a key role in how the economy of the Highlands and Islands evolves over the next few years. So thank you for joining this morning. What I'd really like to do, if I may, is start off by just 2 or 3 introductory observations, and then we're just going to have a question, answer, and indeed conversation time. As we've already heard, the infrastructure deployment across the country has been rapidly starting to move. And I think, again, the Scottish Government strategy, both in the short term, taking us up to 2015 or so, and in the longer term through to 2020, is going to be a critical joining point for all of us, whatever we do, to help realise the country's ambitions. And indeed, by sometime in 2014, just through infrastructure investment from industry, we'll be well down the way with well over 60% of people connected to high-speed fixed broadband. And of course, on top of that, Mike was referring earlier to the significant investment being made by mobile operators as well. So we are absolutely on a journey, but clearly we have significant challenges to overcome in terms of reaching the whole country. But the key thing really for me is as we go through that, and I ask you, some may find it difficult, but imagine that we're getting there. Imagine that the infrastructure is out there, and for those parts that don't have it, it's coming. What are we actually going to do with it? How are we going to exploit it? And when you think about some of the research that's been coming out in the last couple of years throughout the world, not just in the UK, there are very, very clear indications that exploitation of high-speed digital technology can contribute significantly to communities, whether they be cities or whether they be more rural parts of the country. Anywhere between 0.3 and 0.5 of GVA is some of the examples coming through per year. And at a time of recession, that's a major contribution. At the same time, and there was reference earlier to Dumfries and Galloway, the Federation of Small Businesses Scotland, who play a critical role in really garnering understanding in the small business sector, are very clear that access to better infrastructure and then its exploitation as critical to about 40% of Scottish SMEs to get them to invest more and do more. So clearly there's a challenge there that we need to try and address, both through the infrastructure and secondly, I think, through education and support. So looking beyond that into a more social dimension, we need to also think about how are we going to exploit it from a social perspective, and Paul will talk about that. But I think in Scotland, perhaps compared to elsewhere in the UK, we do now have the Digital Participation Action Group that the Cabinet Secretary referred to earlier. And I think at least a recognition, but we need more action clearly, that driving that agenda through digital participation is going to be fundamental to success in the future. So that's enough of a preamble, but in essence, it's all about, where do we go from here? So I'd maybe like to start off, if I can, by asking Ross's observations, who's been looking at this for 20 years in terms of public sector reform, what he sees as I suppose, Ross, both the opportunities and the challenges that you see using this capability.
I think first and foremost, we have to pick up one of the points which was made in the earlier session about organisational change and indeed cultural change in public services across the country. I mean, we do have quite a fast-moving and radical change programme underway across the whole of the public service family. So if you look at the integration of the 8 police forces into one, and then the regionalisation out to 14 divisional commands, the regionalisation of the FE sector, local government beginning to get its act together, and a series of changes both in structural and in systemic terms, which need that cultural and organisational change, and most of that underpinned by the need for better digital connectivity, because that's the thing which will make the difference in terms of driving a service improvement agenda on the one hand, or driving a financial cuts agenda on the other. And it's the use of that digital infrastructure which is going to make that a positive rather than a largely negative experience. And so there are a number of opportunities there, but I suppose I would kick off, Brendan, with a challenge to everybody here, which is to ask if you've been engaged with a nurse or a police officer or a teacher or anybody in the front line of public service delivery at any point over the last 2 or 3 years, talking to them about how that infrastructure can help them do a better job, to provide a better service, to create better care or better policing or better education opportunities for people. If the people in this audience can engage at that service delivery level to help design as well as develop and then deliver better public services, then I think we would be a much stronger country for it.
Okay, thank you. I think that leads interestingly on perhaps to Paul, because SCVO has many thousands of members, and within that, indeed, something that we haven't spoken about much today is a lot of young people involved in the sector, either as volunteers or employees. So taking it down to that more granular level, what do you see as the opportunities, Paul?
I guess a couple, Brendan. First thing is that our mission at SCVO is to support voluntary action so that people can help themselves and help each other and bring about social change. And that's hopefully an ambitious agenda. But if you think about your own engagement in the third sector, what got you involved? And I guess a quick question for the audience, if I may, Brendan. How many of you have volunteered for or donated to or used the services of a third sector organisation in Scotland in the last 5 years? Quick show of hands if that's okay. Okay, a healthy number there, and I suspect there are some who have but haven't been aware of it. If you think about your motivation for getting involved, it's either to make a difference to your place or your community, or to tackle an injustice, or to join up with other people in other parts of the country in a community of interest, or to access services that you or your family or your loved ones need at a particular point in time. Now for me, we can use digital technology to enable many more people to tap into the services that the third sector offers, to connect folk who might be disconnected. And the young person's question in particular, I think we've got a powerful agent for change. We've got colleagues from Young Scott today. Last year I was at the reward ceremony where a group of young people in Loch Gilphead, I think it was, were working with older people in their community to make sure they were able to make the most of digital technology. It gave people a practical benefit, but also broke down intergenerational barriers that perhaps existed. So there's a powerful mix of things that could happen, I would suggest.
Good, thank you. And Carroll, I mean, I'm jumping slightly, Andrew, because something Paul said triggered a thought. I mean, I think Highlands now as enterprise have an interesting role both to drive economic success in the region, but secondly to, I'll use a phrase, ensure sort of community cohesion. Mm-hmm. And there's a linkage, I guess, then in terms of the kind of things Paul's doing with SCVO and your drive as an economic development agency.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a role in economic and social community development. And I think one of the key things we see is, the improvement in digital connectivity opens up opportunity to people in some of our more peripheral areas. Not only opportunities to do business differently, and our earlier panel discussion talked about how a whole range of businesses from small SMEs to big business can do a whole spectrum of things. Firstly, at one end of the spectrum, just by being more aware of what they can already do and doing things better, making more use of what's already available. And at the other end, really highly technical and innovative approaches to doing things differently. But also, we've got a number of business services operators in our area that are very much encouraging home working pilots, for example, which is opening up employment opportunities to people in areas that they just haven't had before, which is absolutely vital to a region like ours, which has a very dispersed population and where, transport and digital connectivity in the past hasn't been all it should have been.
Yeah, okay. And it's interesting, I think I'm right in saying only 2 weeks ago, Inverness, although it's been in the Cities Alliance for some time, technically just got its city boundary defined, if I'm right. And Andrew, you've been leading work across these 7 cities. They're a big driver for the economy. How do you see things going forward in the back of connectivity?
Well, I think cities are really interesting and very important to Scotland. They are really, I think, over history where innovation has emerged and has really driven the economy. And I think we're starting to see a new dialogue taking place. I mean, this event, if we look back 10 years ago, bringing together cross sectors to look at an issue in Scotland really didn't happen. Well, that's starting to happen in our cities. So I think that dialogue around leadership and around setting direction and vision is very important. There's big challenges in our cities, though. And if we look in a city such as Glasgow, there's over 100,000 people in Glasgow not really participating digitally at this moment in time. And actually, if we want to drive forward Scotland, we need to tackle these sorts of issues. I know Glasgow have recently had a dialogue with over 200 people across the city looking at how we can develop programs to tackle that. So I think there's real opportunities around learning, but also about new processes that we can use to explore innovation, be that between community, private sector, and the public sector playing a role. But that requires, I think, a different frame of leadership.
Right. Any particular view, and I wouldn't want to say any of the current leaders aren't doing it well, but any view on what kind of leadership skills are important?
I think a recognition, certainly within the public sector, that we need to open things up. We also need to involve, I think, young people in service design. If we look at the audience here today, could we have a show of hands for how many under 30 in the audience?
Oh dear, not very many.
So
People getting up there,
I think, how can we change that?
Well, I think that's a good point, because I don't think it's unique to this conversation this morning. I think we're probably a bit guilty of having conversations like this on various themes, and it's the rooms full of people our age, apart from the younger colleagues. There was reference earlier as well, just picking up on some of the travel stuff, and I mean, and this pertains both to your very rural part of Scotland, Carroll, but also Ross thinking about the more urban part. I mean, you were a councillor some years ago. Sorry?
I'm recovering.
You're recovering now. It's interesting, as someone who lives in the Central Belt myself, I still have a sense that we, as a country, haven't embraced the capability to work in what I would call an agile way. I think, the train services in Scotland, personally, use them all the time. ScotRail, as they go Wi-Fi, be fantastic. And I wondered, in your exploration of things like productivity, whether is this cultural thing just changing how we behave and changing how we work, which is both individual but also managers allowing staff to do things differently is a critical part of this.
I think if we go back to the push-pull, which I think Nicola mentioned in our contribution earlier. So it's about both creating the conditions for that to happen. So, for example, we, in connectivity terms, in public policy, we're focused on free concessionary bus travel in connectivity rather than free internet usage. And so there's an issue there about creating the conditions. And in public service, there's a lot of work going on across the public service family in terms of homework and learning examples from organisations, frankly, organisations like BT, who have done...
This wasn't a prompt, by the way.
You've done a lot of work on that. And actually, there's a really interesting exercise to be done for the public sector, looking at organisations who came out of the public sector and made that journey into the private sector, and all the changes which happened in that. And some of those changes and innovations which are driven through the system as part of that journey are lessons which the public sector can learn. And that aspect of being a bit more open-minded and a bit freer and a bit less regimental. I mean, we have public services which by and large were created and designed for the mass production era in the post-war period, and they pertained for over half a century. And we need a much more personalised public service. And what's good for the delivery side in terms of the public using the service should also be good for staff in terms of personalising their experience and their opportunity to work in different ways, whether that's at home, on the move, or in an office environment.
And I think from personal experience, it's a bit of everything, because anyone who was purely a home worker probably would go barking mad after a few weeks, I suspect. It leads in, I think, really to thinking about how we mobilise, in my head, to really try and get out there and help people get online and do stuff. And Paul, I guess one of your challenges in SCVO is that whilst SCVO is the umbrella body, it can't tell all these third sector organisations what to do. So have you got any ideas about what you think we should be doing from your perspective?
A couple of things. I guess it's about getting more organisations in our sector to sign up to the digital participation action groups, aims, and about making an active step to change practice in organisations. But the other thing I think is to tell good stories about what can be done. And I was lucky enough to sit next to a colleague, Jeff, earlier on from an organisation called Ammon Networks, which is about connecting communities. And we talked earlier on about the economic impact of what digital technology can do. It's absolutely crucial to Scotland, no debate about that. There's also the social impact and some of the work that Jeff and his organisation are interested in. Just to quote here, at a community level, it's about connecting teachers to pupils, doctors to patients, clergy to parishioners, clubs to their members, so on and so forth. And these are all very practical things that make a difference in people's life day and daily. Now, by multiplying those stories, by making the opportunities digital presents relevant to their day-to-day lives, we will encourage more people to engage. If you're in a lower income, if you're retired, whatever, your ability to purchase things, using technology might be limited, but your ability to make a difference to yourself and community is unlimited.
I think that there's also a point there, Brendan, about not getting too far ahead of ourselves and recognising that there is a lot of good work going on and we need to spread a lot of that work before we move on to the next step. One of the learning experiences for me after having been a councillor in West Lothian and pushing at the forefront in a number of areas is going around the country and still seeing some of that stuff not having been done in some local authorities, just because we're not very good at learning from each other. And I think in the digital world, then surely we have the means, if only we have the ambition and the ability to learn from each other and take as many people with us on that journey at each step as possible.
I think that's right, and I'd like to come to the UHI in a minute, Carroll, for me, but Andrew, I know some of the work you've done in the Cities Alliance has been trying to really look at some good data across the cities of why people may be excluded from digital, and there are patterns, I think, is that right? But are we learning from each other is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Cities Alliance is interesting. It's one of these new forms of collaboration. It involves the universities, it involves the cities, and it involves all Scottish Government and all of its agencies. And over the last year, actually, it's been, I think a lot of officers have said, this is great. We didn't talk together as cities before. There wasn't a forum for the leaders or for the officers to get together. So that's a great start, but we need to start saying from that, how can we make projects happen across the cities? There's some great innovations taking place, but how do we move that forward?
So I guess for the audience here, the challenge is to support and indeed expect activity now on the back of some good work.
Absolutely. Once you set the foundations, which takes time, then you need to move things forward.
Okay. I'm going to maybe ask Carroll to comment on University of the Highlands and Islands for two reasons. One, clearly we know that our academic and skills agenda is critical to what we're doing for all sorts of reasons, not just for digital. And in fact, sitting here in Heriot Watt, I think most know that they've been at the forefront of e-learning, if I can call it that, for many years, both in country and abroad. But UHI is going through a critical time. You're developing the new campus. And in terms of driving the Highland economy, some views on the linkage between learning and economic development?
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of evidence worldwide to demonstrate how the presence of a university can really drive economic development in a region. And the Highlands and Islands hasn't had a university of its own before. The UHI is a multi-campus university, and I suppose it's got two key aims. One is to enable people living in a very dispersed area to access learning at all levels, tertiary education, and the other is to attract more young people into our region. We have an issue with them. Our population currently is actually growing, but it's also an ageing population, and we've got that missing generation, and we see the UHI as a fundamental step in helping attract back that generation. The campus in Inverness is a real part of that, but I think one of the keys of UHI, and we can, all levels of education can learn from the example, is about remote delivery and enabling people to access the full curriculum of subjects, no matter where they are, which is quite a challenge in some of our schools currently. And I do think we've got a lot to learn there, and a long way to go in how we actually deliver education.
And in terms of supporting businesses, the vast majority of which are SMEs, obviously, in the Highlands and Islands, part of that's education and learning, as had been mentioned earlier before. You already do a lot in High and through Business Gateway, clearly in the Highlands as well, to try and drive that out, but it's difficult to touch every business. Do you see the new connectivity that's evolving, both fixed and mobile, as being important in helping you do your job more effectively, bigger reach?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the opportunities are pretty limitless. We're already in advance of the infrastructure programme rolling out an ICT engagement and skills development programme with businesses at all levels and across all levels of technical ability. So I think that's key. I mean, the way we are doing our business is changing as well. I mean, we can deal with customers now, our clients, remotely and using digital means. And going back to the leadership point, I think there is a point there that we have to lead by example, and we're not always terribly good at doing that. So I think there's a job for the public sector there too.
Right. And I guess a thought that's just occurred to me, Paul, put you a bit in the spot on this one, is third sector organisations are businesses with a small b. They might not be there to make a profit, but they still have to run as an efficient operation. So working with, you know, Carroll and Scottish Enterprise Business Gateway, do you see an opportunity for collaboration that will help the third sector itself become much more efficient in how it uses digital capability?
I think there's got to be lots of scope there. We heard earlier on the RSC's inquiry into, you know, digital participation was noting that many businesses already, mainstream businesses, don't make sufficient use of the technology that's available. That's absolutely mirrored in the third sector. And the stats around our sector are interesting. You know, 84% of charities have got less than £100,000 a year in income. Yeah. So there are lots of organisations doing a lot with a little. There are other organisations that are delivering services to scale but still not making the most of the technology that's available. There are some nice exceptions, but there's certainly more to be done in terms of knowledge transfer, upskilling, absolutely.
Thinking about, there was an observation earlier, I think from 2 or 3 speakers about the challenges evolving, I suppose, the procurement process, and which would then lead to deliver services. And Ross, from your experience of when you were a councillor and obviously studying this beyond, the relationship between the third sector and, say, a local authority, for example, are you optimistic about how that relationship will evolve for the better delivery of services in the geography? And what needs to change to make it happen?
I am optimistic because we see a breaking down of the monopolistic nature of local government, both in terms of its own operation. So we're beginning to see different solutions in different parts of the country, and Scottish Government have made huge progress in terms of ending that old template mentality of what's good for the centre of Glasgow is good for Orkney, and beginning to look at local government in different ways in different parts of the country. And then, you know, going down to the local level from there, different local authorities treating different parts of their area in different ways, and not being afraid to take on that pathetic challenge that people make about postcode prescribing. Mm-hmm. Of course we want postcode prescribing because we want different solutions to match different problems in different areas. And I think public services are beginning to understand that a huge part of that diversity of provision is going to come through the third sector, through social enterprises and cooperative movement in particular, and to get them involved much more in both the design and the development, as well as just the delivery of public services on their behalf.
Thank you. And hopefully the digital agenda will help that. So I think we're nearly out of time. I just want to maybe finish on what I think is I hope, so Andrew's going to answer the question, a good positive note in an international sense. I think one of the failings we have, and it's not unique to Scotland, I think it happens in the UK generally, is quite often when we look at what our cities are doing, we tend to compare ourselves. So Edinburgh compares with Glasgow or Manchester, wherever, which is fine, but it's not ambitious enough. And when you look at Scottish cities' performance in European or global terms, some of them are quite good, but they're not fantastic. And I wonder, Andrew, given that at least the cities are now collaborating, will we get to a point where the cities really present in a digital way and in a digital world themselves to the globe as somewhere to come and invest collectively?
I think we're already starting to see some of that work as an alliance, and we've set up a number of work streams to improve our sort of international presence, not just on digital, but across a number of sectors where we're working. But I think, and one of my lessons I've presented last year in Singapore to a similar forum to this across Asia, and gave some examples of the innovations happening in Scotland. And I would say, really, the reaction I got from the audience there was, you're doing pretty well. We're doing well as a nation. We need to celebrate that more. Right. But we also, I think, need to make sure that we're learning from other countries at the same time.
Okay. Right, well, thank you. Well, look, I think we're timed out, Irene, pretty much. I hope that conversation was helpful. I think the value for me, certainly, out of that was to think broadly about the opportunities on the back of a digital infrastructure and recognise at the same time, as I'm sure you picked up, some of the many challenges, many of which are cultural and organisational, that we need to think about in parallel to realise the ambition. But I'd like to conclude by asking you all to put your hands together and thank the 4 panellists that have taken part.